Hi, everybody. Good to see you. Very good to see all these faces. Welcome back to 19V. We're really looking forward to another year of the seminar series. And as usual, I want to open by thanking the Jordan Center and Sasha Spitalnik, who give us a lot of support, and also by extending special thanks to Sarah Dickinson, who does the very hard work of putting together the seminar series. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'll give a few notes on what's coming up later in the semester. On Wednesday, February 8th, and that's at noon Eastern time, as always, we will have speaker Mariana Muravyova, who, by the way, is собеседник today, who will be speaking on, quote, new unfortunates, degeneracy and violence against parents in Imperial Russia. Then on Wednesday, February 22nd, Lyudmila Peters-Hoffman, an art historian, will speak with us. Now I'm ready to introduce today's speakers, so I think we can start recording now. And hello again, everybody. Today's speaker is Olga Petri of Cambridge University. Hi, Olga, who's going to talk about her book, Places of Heat, Commercial Bathhouses in Queer Geography of Late 19th Century St. Petersburg. And our собеседник is Mariana Muravyova from the University of Helsinki. Olga.
Thank you very much, Hannah, for your introduction. Just to clarify things, I will talk only actually about one chapter in my book. It's about commercial bathhouses in late Imperial Russia. And before I do that, I would like to thank everyone for joining us today and for inviting me to speak at the Jordan Center for Advanced Study of Russia. I'm very much excited to be here. And as I said, today I will present one aspect of my bigger project on the queer geography of late Imperial St. Petersburg. I'm a geographer by training. I'm considering myself urban historical geographer. And this project I turned into a monograph, which has title Places of Tenderness and Heat, the queer milieu of Fin-de-Siècle St. Petersburg. And today we focus on places of heat. So just commercial bathhouses. And before I do that, I think I will say literally 3 sentences about this project, because it will help you also to understand the talk about commercial bathhouses. And in this project, it's first of all, it's first dedicated study of male homosexual or queer milieu of Fin-de-Siècle St. Petersburg, specifically in the period between 1879 and 1914. And in this project, I developed a kind of alternative conceptual framing for a queer urban imaginary in which emotional geographies of public garden, the quasi-commons of commercial bathhouses, and discretionary power of the street all combine to create a complex and underexplored queer milieu. I brought new archival materials and kind of conceptual perspectives from critical urban studies to reconstruct queer lives in geographical details, and explored a kind of effective literacy that once enables my work's historical protagonists to navigate a highly nuanced and contested landscape as late Imperial St. Petersburg. And I recovered an informal and adaptive street level, actually, practices that constrain queer encounters, but also complemented and substitute the more frequently studied sodomist laws and medical practices. So St. Petersburg itself, in my book, emerges as a kind of a key protagonist in the book, an ambivalent and perhaps even unfaithful ally to both queer men and the authorities in the liminal space between law and lawlessness. So that's the introduction for the whole book. And today I will talk about chapter 4, which is about commercial bathhouses. And I will start this before we do, like basically my talk structured according to the things. I will start with introduction. I will introduce you to the phenomenon of commercial bathhouses. What is this? And then the center of my talk is about the ordinance of 1879. It's a kind of the main urban authorities' attempt to regulate this space, right? So, but when we think about commercial bathhouses, of course, we think about commercial sex and specifically about bathhouse attendants or banshiki. I will mention them a lot in this text. And I would like to start this talk with a couple of names. Alexander, Grigory, and Sasha. You know, these three bathhouse attendants were mentioned on the pages of Mikhail Kuzmin's diary, picture of whom you can see on this slide. And many of you in this Zoom room will know that he was a pioneer of Russian homosexual literature, a musician, and a well-regarded poet, but also he was an Orbit resident in his private capacity, who lived in St. Petersburg and left for us the impressions of the city, of his meetings with friends, and other encounters, like all encounters he has in the city. And he encountered this young three men in commercial bathhouse in Bathhouse, commercial bathhouse more specifically. I will show this bathhouse a bit later. And these encounters with them played a prominent role in his diary. We can even say that his life was enriched and fulfilled by them. His affection seemed really sincere in general. Whether theirs will of course remain unclear. Alexander, Grigory, and Sasha, they slept with Kuzmin and were in some instances paid in return, but they also introduced Kuzmin to their families and spent social time together. Kuzmin shared, in fact, many happy moments with them and regarded them as a friend and lovers. So this is the one picture of commercial bathhouses and the role of bathhouses in that space, right? So there were kind of friends and lovers. Of course, they offer sex for money, but that's one image. But we also have another image. And for this image, we have to go back in time in the 19th century, because it's a 19th century seminar. So we have to focus on the 19th century. And in the last decades of the 19th century, both newspapers articles, police records, and also medical forensic investigations, they kind of offered a view of the bathhouse attendants as the one who were deprived, you know, the one who was selling the sex. And specifically, I would like to mention three medical forensic practitioners. It's Vladimir Bekhterev, we have Eugene Tarnovsky, and Vladislav Merzhievsky. Three of them described what they call cartel of the bohers, bathhouse attendants who was offering sexual services to the visitors, and kind of formed this ring of people, organized prostitution ring, which according to these medical practitioners include a large fractions of the city's bathhouse attendants. Whether organized or not, these activities provided security and financial stability for these attendants, right? So the striking image, the striking discrepancy between these two images, the one with encounter motivated by what was called depravity and financial interest described in the medical forensic literature, and the romantic one in even tragic voice of commercial personal accounts might be as commonplace as with the proverbial attachment between prostitute and client, right? Kuzmin's descriptions in conjunction with interviews and protocols included in doctor's report and archives, however, create a composite picture that indicates a flourishing queer world in the bathhouses that went beyond discrete prostitution. And today I would like to talk about the circumstances that gave rise to and shaped this milieu, the demographic situation in the city, bathhouse regulations, and the urban tradition of banshiko, bathhouse attendants, all contributed to that. And I would like to focus specifically on one aspect of this milieu, which significantly shaped the experience of men, both who visited the space and who worked there and managed the space. It's the city's attempt to regulate commercial bathhouse. This is the ordinance of 1879. But before we talk about this major attempt to clean, so to say, this space, let me introduce you to commercial bathhouses. So what is this commercial bath? I shouldn't forget to change the slides. It's very easily done when you're on Zoom. So I put it actually on this slide, one commercial bathhouse, which personally dear to me. It's very close to the place in St. Petersburg where I used to live. So it's located on Bathhouse Street. And in fact, Kuzmin visited this particular bathhouse quite often. So it has a very symbolic meaning for this presentation and for this talk. So what is commercial bathhouse? The term commercial bathhouse was and continues to be used to refer to publicly accessible, privately owned bathhouse. And such institutions could be found in every Russian city and were usually operated for profit. So of course, there were commercial bathhouses, not commercial bathhouses attached to factories and other institutions, but we today talk about probably 90% of bathhouses in the city, which were commercially run for profit, right? So by 1899, by the late 19th century, by the end of the century, there were 60 bathhouses in the city, right? Most of them were large brick buildings, as the one I showed you on the slide, right? For example, the Voronin bathhouse, which was the most frequently mentioned bathhouse in a contemporary literature, and the layouts of which I will show you a bit later, was large and efficient enough to process roughly 800,000 of visitors per year. So it was a huge institution, right? Of course, that is the biggest, but still, you can see that it was a really big business in the city. Each bathhouse had to have at least one section for men and one section for women, due to the ban of unisex bathing in the city introduced by Peter the Great in early 18th century. So the different services offered by commercial bathhouses in the city in St. Petersburg made it possible to satisfy the needs of customers according to their means and preferences. And of course, to prevent inter-class mixing and maximize income for bathhouse owners. So the bathhouses were typically divided into sections. And let's briefly look at the different sections. And that's what I said. Oh, I forgot about the map. I'm a geographer who forgot about the map. So here on this map, you can see the city center of St. Petersburg. And this is the Basseyne. This is the Basseyne bathhouse, frequently visited by Kuzmin. Also another one, the Manezhne bathhouse, which doesn't exist anymore in St. Petersburg, also located close to the Ryzhevsky Garden, another important cruising site in the city. So just as a form of context. So returning to the layouts of the bathhouses, the first section is Prostaya Banya, or simple bathhouse. It had changing, washing, and steam rooms. And then on this slide, you can see that it's a letter E, that's the Prostaya Banya. So as I said, visitors could wash and do their laundry by themselves using buckets and tubes in the washing room. A contemporary medical practitioner, Vyserion Znamensky, who spent many years studying commercial bathhouses and bathing more broadly as a practice, as a medical practice, described these sections as the dirtiest ones, the filthiest one. And due to the low entrance fee, and by the way, the entrance fee was fixed by the city regulation at a level of 5 kopecks, the poorest urban residents visited these facilities, right? So maybe coachmen and unskilled workers, right? The second section, the Dvukhrivennaya Banya, was tidier, altogether less crowded and more comfortable, and costed 10 kopecks. As I said, again, set by city regulation. On this slide, you might see them. It's letter C. It has the same structure. It's a washing room, changing room, steam room. It offered options such as a full-service laundry, a cafeteria, a hairdresser, and Znamensky, for example, said that its merchants and the members of petty bourgeoisie could afford a visit here. So we can see clearly social kind of segregated spaces within the commercial bathhouses. The third section, the Dvukhrivennaya Banya, was even more luxurious space with soft rugs and good copper washing basins, right? It kind of offered the same services as Dvukhrivennaya Banya, but they were much higher level. It was not unheard of even to see members of royal family actually visiting the section of the most established and fashionable bathhouses, for example, like Voronin's bathhouse, right? So all such commercial bathhouses and all of these sections had to be open at least 4 times a week, usually Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturdays, all day and night. So they were not closed during the nights. So they completely 24 hours opening. Commercial bathhouses could be closed only for 3 days a week, and then the owners would decide which day to pick. So, and that was done supposedly to clean furnaces and prepare fuel, but more convincingly to avoid incurring the high fixed cost of heating for lower concentrations of visitors spread through the week, right? So it's economics also involved here, of course. And I would like to introduce you to the fourth section for commercial bathhouses, what was called Nomernaya or Семейная Banya. We need the slide for this. Both terms will exist interchangeably, Семейная, family baths, or Nomernaya Banya, bathing rooms. existed in majority of commercial bathhouses in the city. This section looks like a hotel or boarding house. On this layout, you can see it's here, letter H. So it's kind of, you see the rooms are arranged around the corridor. Sorry. And although relatively expensive, and the entrance fee was not regulated by the city authorities, so the owners could regulate the price production for this section themselves. The Mirnaya Banya didn't have the steaming room. It was simply a room with a bathtub and a resting area. And actually on this slide, you see the bathtub and a resting area. Due to the absence of steam room, this section remained open throughout the whole week, making the Mirnaya Banya a source of a significant income for bathhouse owner. And this is very important for the things we will discuss a bit later. So that section was open throughout the week, and the price regulation was up to bathhouse owners and managers. So as you can see that the commercial bathhouses were in essence a distinctively urban adaptation of Asian ration bathing customs, right? The steaming room, washing room is kind of the same as you can find in a village, right? But two elements of this urban adaptation deserve emphasis. Firstly, bathhouses operated with the help of so-called, banshiki or bathhouse attendants, people I introduced at the beginning of this talk, who offer services such as washing, soaping, scrubbing, raising, massaging, and assisting in the room. They also clean the space. They also prepare the steam room. So they were doing all this job without actually getting a salary. They were working for tips. And on the next slide, I put the picture done by Carla Bruait. So it's an idealized image, stage photo of the work of bathhouse attendants in a commercial bathhouse. So at least you get a sense. Of course, it's a stage photo, but you will get a sense of the proximity between clients and bathhouse attendants, right? On the other side of the picture, you see actually the Mirnaya Banya in Voronezh's bathhouses. So you see a corridor with the rooms. And bathhouse attendants are standing next to it, ready to help you if you need any help. So that's the first element. Bathhouse attendants was this urban adaptation of what we might say Asian Russian bathing custom. And the second element, as I said, it's this Mirnaya Banya that offered a very strange space between private and public, right? So you can actually close the door and be alone with your family, because actually the ban on mixed bathing doesn't operate in this particular space. So you could bring your family and bathe together, right? So that's this urban bathing culture, of course, was not frozen in time, right? And not in its evolution during the last decades of Imperial Russia, and specifically during the last decades of the 19th century, Dan Healy, the prominent historian of sexuality and homosexuality specifically in Imperial Russia, he sees that this institution kind of changed in the last decades of the 19th century. And he briefly explains that more or less egalitarian work teams of attendants who pulled together their earnings from sex with male patrons was replaced by the end of the 19th century by tightly run commercial organization of young male sex workers managed by a usually older attendant. So, and Healy notes that the temporal threshold between these two phases remained indistinct from existent sources, as he says. So I believe that the Bathhouse Ordinance of 1879, that was not available at the time of Healy's writing, was actually the most likely drivers of the increased commercialization of male prostitution in bathhouses observed by Healy. So, as I said already, that urban bathhouses were distinctly, decidedly mainstream activity. Everyone went to commercial bathhouses, but of course not a problematic one. Even contemporary Russians, medical forensic discussions or newspapers, they pointedly divided as to what to do with the Russian commercial bathhouses. On the one hand, there was the inspiration to make them almost like a machines of rationalistic public hygiene, right? Or maybe keep commercial bathhouses as a ready-made bastions of traditional Russian communion worthy of protection from Westernization influences. And Let me now move to the next slide here, because I would like to show you, this is kind of the images also from Voronin's bathhouses, where, instead of steam rooms and tubs, which were considered to be less hygienic, we see now shower rooms. That's the kind of progressive thinking about washing in the city, right? So the tension between, of course, actual practice and conflicting ideas of bathing very much defined the struggle of St. Petersburg municipal administration to manage this particular urban space. And of course, the persistence of what they were calling sexual deviance within it, right? The ordinance marked the transition from a bathing tradition in which prostitution was somehow peripheral to one in which it was central to the commercial viability in this single urban space. But how it happened, it is important. Prior to the launch of systematic bathhouse reforms by the City Duma in 1879, the major office made various attempts to understand and improve situation in a city's commercial bathhouse. And then on this slide, I also put the archival document, which contains all of the stories, how actually the city tried to change and improve the situation. So for example, the city mayor assembled a commission of doctors, policemen, firemen, and architects in 1870s to inspect all of city's 46 commercial bathhouses, and also later obtain a design plan for a model bathhouse. So the members of the commission argued that the city bathhouses suffer from several shortcomings, including unsafe and unsanitary conditions, of course, as well as, and I quote here, immoral behaviors by attendants, guests, owners, and operations, end of the quote. So based on these findings, the city found a prominent architect, Pavel Suzor, to design bathhouses that could meet sanitary and technical requirements. And during the 1870s, in fact, 10 of these bathhouses were constructed using the money of private investments. So the city didn't build them. It was a private investments who were brought to the projects. But the situation in other bathhouses improved little, as further inspection reports and the citizens' tip-offs and publication, such as, for example, Maria Rievsky book I showed at the beginning of this talk of 1878, all indicate the situation didn't really improve, and it remained this place of cartel of debauchery, right? As a result, in 1879, the city made a major legislative initiative was passed targeting as the sanitary and moral improvements of St. Petersburg commercial bathhouses. In fact, it specifically addressed many shortcomings identified in the report of the Commission in the 70s on the bathhouses mentioned earlier, right? So the Bathhouse Ordinance, or обязательное постановление об устройстве в городе Санкт-Петербурге общественных бань, or simply the ordinance, I will call it in this talk, was adopted by the city's Duma in 1879 and set out requirements pertaining to the construction, layout, physical maintenance, and day-to-day management of the city's bathhouses. The goal of the ordinance was to standardize and regulate the physical characteristics and services of commercial bathhouses, to improve the sanitary condition, and to suppress illicit and hygienic behaviors, such as, for example, doing laundry or having sex. Right? It was not just another ordinance, but the municipal administration's first and only boldly systematic attempt to extend the government sphere deeply into the St. Petersburg commercial bathing spaces. In short, the ordinance set out exact standards for construction and internal layouts of bathhouses to make sure of proper insulation, ventilation, avoid droughts, and manage other health and safety risks. But most importantly for our discussion, is the role of banshiki. Bathhouse Ordinance was addressed with a particular emphasis and care in the second part of the ordinance. So attendants were no longer permitted to sleep in the bathhouses off the duty, eliminating an excuse to retain sleeping bays in, for example, basements, which were also used for sexual activities. They became subject to capped working hours that were far shorter in the duration of additional shifts, in effect requiring operators to increase the number of attendants. Moreover, new regulation required attendants to leave the bathhouse promptly upon the completion of their shifts. Before that, they would simply leave in the basement, but they wouldn't, it was not possible for them after the passing of the ordinance. Finally, they also have to pass regular free medical checks, most likely intended to stem the tide of syphilis infections. You know, I came across many reports, medical forensic report of bathhouses containing the syphilis, and it was basically the same type of the medical check that prostitutes, female prostitutes had to do in the city. The same type of institutions were doing these checks. So by early 1883, a couple of years later, following 2 rounds of inspections, officials concluded that the city's 60 commercial bathhouses, only 11 were compliant with all material respects. I don't think you're surprised, right? 5 had been subject to inspections, but remaining 42 demonstrated most egregious breaches. Of these, 2 were shut permanently, so to say, on spot. It's quite a funny report, because as I quote here, the further existence was recognized to be impossible. I really like the phrase, it's impossible to, so they were closed the same hour, basically. The many others, which had achieved partial compliance, had to be left alone in an immediate and marked deviation from injunction of the ordinance. Clearly, the city administration could not dispense with the vast majority of institutions. They couldn't close all commercial bathhouses in the city simply because the urban residents wouldn't have another place to go to wash. So they could, and do the laundry, so they couldn't do it. Those 42 bathhouse operators were warned only and received an extension of 6 months to comply. The failure of bathhouses to comply with ordinance made it almost impossible for sanitary commission and the city council to take broader action. But the ordinance itself, of course, was to blame. Legislators, having neglected to anticipate collective non-compliance, had relied on a simply binary concept of compliance and stability closure as the only available governmental response, even for minor deviation from requirements. This, by early 1883, was obviously unrealistic. It took a while for inspector and regulators to find their footing, and gradually a new entente emerged, following a push for compliance and moral disciplines in 1887, when the ordinance was amended to shorten the hours of nighttime operators, especially in the Mirnaya Banya, and flurry and unannounced inspection of raids took place around the same time. Subsequent evidence suggests that non-compliance could be negotiated along broadly predictable lines in what is yet another characteristic example of a broad discretion accorded to the state frontline representatives in managing cities public and city public spaces, about which I talk actually in my book more broadly. So the letters to the major from bathhouse owners, and there are many of them in archives, those bathhouses had been shut following inspection, demonstrate that in some bathhouses, partial, even complete reopening was accompanied with a tailoring restrictions on opening times or obligation to replace attendance, despite continuing non-compliance with the other aspects. Similarly, an agreement on measurements to address the most kind of serious breaches of the ordinance or other requirements sufficient to warrant at least partial reopening or to temporarily stay at the threat of imposed closure. Negotiated non-compliance increased, and it's very important for our discussion, the prominence of the Mirnaya Banya, the one that actually was an ideal space for sexual encounter. And as it turns out, paved the way to a grassroots response to the ordinance that could have been further from the author's intention, including a redoubled emphasis on and commercialization of bathhouse's role as a sexual space in the city. Bathhouse operator Adrian Gustav, for example, went so far as to claim the failure to reopen his Mirnaya Banya would inevitably lead to his bankruptcy and closure of entire bathhouse. His rationale was easy enough for his addressees to interpret. This was the only section for which prices were not regulated, right? And the Mirnaya Banya was those completed freely for customers. The city government responded opportunistically. On the one hand, a number of bathhouses were indeed permitted to keep this section open. So even while the other parts of bathhouses remained closed, so they would just keep this Mirnaya Banya open the whole week, the whole month, while the other parts were just closed for the public. On the other hand, and so owners would get their income from the Mirnaya Banya, they didn't have any incentive even to open their communal spaces. On the other hand, in what happens at textbook examples of so-called sin taxes, the city council proposed raising taxes on the Nimirnaya Banya, which had not been touched since 1838, right? Perhaps to sweeten this bitter pill, the burden of tax was transformed from operators, from managers, actually to the owners, who now had to pay 2% of the rental income assessed as relative to the Nimirnaya Banya, right? So they introduced this six taxes, sin taxes on Nimirnaya Banya. This increasingly prominent role of Nimirnaya Banya in bathhouse operations corresponded to a less visible but equally important adaptation in the culture and economy of sexual encounters in the city's commercial bathhouses. As we have seen, prostitution was hardly new to commercial bathhouses, and yet there are several indications that something changed following the passing of the ordinance. Indeed, prostitution evolved from a side hustle, the financial reward from which were shared just like the other tips among the bathhouse attendants, into a, if not the main business line for banshiki. Often they were organized, as say, by an older attendant, and he will organize the whole financial operation. This adjustment in the entente between city authorities, bathhouse operators, attendants, and patrons is hardly surprising, given an impact of the ordinance on the position of bathhouse attendants. The ordinance, as I said, barred them from living in the bathhouses, so they had to find a different place to live and pay for this place to live, shortened their shifts, again, which is less opportunity to get more tips. This change relatively easy to monitor and did not, this change in the ordinance was relatively easy to monitor by authorities and did not require large upfront investment by bathhouse owners. So bathhouse owners were actually happy to do these changes in the bathhouse operations. As a result, banshiki became even more dependent on tips. And this change in their circumstances pushed them towards those among their activities that provided the largest tips. And the single most lucrative of these was sex with the male clients. The result was even more entrenched, organized, and commodified prostitution. We're coming close to conclusion here. Once Foucault, as Foucault put it, it became apparent if one governed too much, one did not govern at all, or one provoked the results contrary to those one desired. And I think this quote really, embodies what happened to this ordinance. Far from a successful penetration or appreciation of cities' bathing spaces by progressive regulatory control and spatial ordering, the degree of governmental influence over this space, if anything, declined after 1880s, as the increasing commercialization and encouragement of sex in the bathhouses suggest. St. Petersburg bathhouses, quasi-commons as I call them, survived and flourished. They did this by shifting their resources towards the Nimirnaya Banya and illicit sex, which were in the adapted anonymous form distinctly urban, but at the same time, packed back to the village roots of communal bathing as both necessary and a pastime. A story of the ordinance shows that negotiation over queer spatial spaces took on many forms and not just one concerned directly with enforcement of sodomy's law. So in this talk, I attempted to shed some light on, I'd like to change. No, sorry. Yeah, I don't want you to see this just in a second. I attempted to shed some lights on circumstances that facilitated the emergence of this queer environment in the commercial bathhouses in late 19th century, St. Petersburg. And I would like to finish this talk again with Michael Kuzmin and his dialogue with one of the bathhouse attendant, Alexander, who then became actually his lover. And this short description, you will read it in a second, served as maybe as a starting point of discussion about actual experience of commercial bathhouse, what was actually happening there. We might think about how in a world of steam and soap, two men found a moment of open intimacy, a moment which, despite being purely commercial, of course we shouldn't forget about that, indicates surprisingly indiscretion and in end led to a lasting emotional involvement, even if we see this only from one side, from Kuzmin's side. So on the 23rd of December 1905, Kuzmin wrote in his diary, he was tall, well-built, with a small black mustache, light, bright eyes, and almost blonde hair. I was in a very awkward, but not unpleasant situation. Both knew the thing, but remained silent. He stared at me motionlessly, like a mermaid, neither drunk nor mad, almost frighteningly. But he started watching me unambiguously. He didn't particularly please me. More precisely, I liked him generally, as a young and available man. After your general phrases, we started talking as if we were thieves. What is your name? It's Kuzmin asking. Alexander. I never intended to come in here. That's all right, it happens, but then one remembers in passing. I don't have any much on me. Don't worry, pay me later. You will trust me on credit? Just so. So I think that's a really good phrase to finish this talk, just so, for you to imagine the queer milieu of commercial bathhouses in late 19th century St. Petersburg. Thank you very much for your attention.
Olga, thank you so much for that fascinating talk. Mariana Muravyova will start the discussion.
Olga, thanks very much for the presentation, and I've had a look now at your book. I'm sorry I haven't read it yet, but I've read, of course, there are some chapters that are of interest to me. My own research into queer spaces comes a little bit earlier than yours, so I'm looking into 17th and 18th centuries, and also urban geographies and managing and working with the spaces, including the bathhouse. And the bathhouses actually at that period were multifunctional spaces that catered to a unisex audience, and the prohibition to have the unisex bathhouses was invoked by Elizabeth Petrovna, Elizabeth I, a famous case of 1744 when she sort of introduced her moral program of regulation of bathhouses, in a sense that those regulations were among the first ones, especially in the regular cities. We call them regular cities in the 18th century, St. Petersburg, to manage both public morals and at the same time to provide urban sort of space policing to that. And sort of my research looks a lot into how that policing the space and new types of policing that comes in the 18th century are very much dependent on the organization of the city, and a new type of organization which St. Petersburg presented as a city built on a regular with a regular plan, and with the idea that policing could be also facilitated by the built-in environment, rather than that the built-in environment would actually be created for. So, well, like Moscow is there's no built-in environment, that's pretty much all chaos. And so, for your talk, I've been thinking, and I've been reading the chapter, and I've been thinking about how sort of masculine citizenship and a gendered sexual citizenship works especially queer citizenship works to cultivate the spaces, to manage the spaces, and to use any available space to perform those practices of both queerness and masculinity, based on their relationship with what is considered public-private. I haven't yet found it in your book, but so, I've been thinking along the lines of how banya in Russian and коммерческая banya is this space which creates intimacy practices, but at the same time, it is a public space. So this is a great sort of conceptual possibility and a practical possibility for people, and in our case, men, to use the space available to them, which is the public space that is the masculine space, but also practice sexual encounters that are technically prohibited by law. Now, 1879, of course, it's not as bad as, it used to be before. Like 1840s would be the worst time for masculine queer communities. 1879, it's already when they're discussing the new uложение, and when there's a lot of approaches to say that, well, homosexuality is really not a crime, it's rather an illness. I've published on that quite a lot, and sort of that discussion, I don't want to sort of fit into that. But sort of for you talked about this ordinance as this agent and tool of the government to regulate moral space and the commercial space. But what I would like to probably sort of for you to elaborate on is that how the ordinance came about to be this way. I mean, obviously, it follows a certain a trend in Europe at the time. I mean, Russia is not the only one that wants to regulate. I mean, if you look in other countries, that's the same sort of along the lines of regulation. In the UK, you have Disease Act, and after the Disease Act, they regulate the space exactly the same way. There's also a lot of in urban literature and also queer urban literature to show that there is a lot of regularity. So that this wish, or this, sort of the states want to regularize or to create a certain type of spatial use that would be easy to manage by the state, rather than would be comfortable or convenient for the actors in this space. And in the end, of course, I always ask the question as you started, and I think it was a preliminary before we actually started, there's no women in there, but queer culture is not just about men, that we talk about men because they're more visible. The state is focused on prosecuted men. We don't really know much about women. Well, we do actually, some of us do. So for my sort of talk, and that's the comparison, and that I do that in my talk. What about women? Do we have any evidence, or have you come across working in the archives of any evidence actually women using bathhouse spaces for also sex work, commercial sex, but also as intimacy spaces? And what, in your opinion, talking about like queer male culture, would be the consequences for women, or the practices for women to actually use that space, which is public, but at the same time it is a secluded space for creating intimacy? Thank you.
Thank you, Mariana. I will, you said a lot, so we'll try to address a couple of things. You mentioned the first, how the ordinance became an agent of change, and the second one about women. So ordinance as the agent of change, I think it's not much you can include in 35 minutes conversation, but of course, the ordinance came about at the same time when the same kind of initiatives were introduced in the United States, in the UK, in France. And I touched upon a bit about this in my book, mostly in the references, because it's not really a part of my discussion, of course. But, that was a part of these ideas of hygienic modernity ideas, how to create a city where urban residents could enjoy urban life, but also remain healthy, right? And hygienic in a way. So obviously there was a part of these larger debates in the Western world, and we shouldn't forget about that. We talk about the global North, if I might use this terminology for now, and of course, a very different practices, very different laws, very different regulations were introduced in the global South around the same time, places like Mumbai or Lagos. So it's completely different stories there. But we focus on the Western modernity, on the Western hygienic modernity. People like Chris Otter, who is probably the best person to consult on these questions, or Miles Osborne. But yeah, it became the agent because of this probably larger debates, because of this discourse of change around that time, and the idea that through the change, through the regulations, through the modernization or practical modernization, we can transform not just physical space, but also urban mentality. We can create what Foucault would call able-bodied workers, forcing them to go to bathhouses that is clean and hygienic, right? So that's how it probably became an agent of change, right? It probably, but I'm not an expert on the 18th century, would be completely different in the 18th century. As you mentioned, the conception of private and public back then was very different, and you're absolutely right to say that bathhouse is what I call in my book, it's a semi-public space, because simultaneously people were performing a very public acts, simultaneously private acts, right? So they were having sex in a public space. Sex is a private act, right? So that's, I think, how I would answer the question about the agency of the ordinance. regarding the women, as you can imagine, I get this question a lot, and which is completely understandable. The problem is that this book is based on my PhD, which is in the UK 3 years. Not much can be done. Not a lot of things can be done in 3 years, so it limits your scope and analysis, obviously. Also, when I was doing my archival research on queer milieu, I encounter stories of women in bathhouses, of course. There are many of them, and we have fantastic scholars of female prostitution in Imperial St. Petersburg or in Imperial Russia more broadly. So they touched upon that. Actually, stories of same sex between women, I didn't encounter specifically. But again, it might be the future historians will actually find them, and it will be absolutely amazing stories to tell. It's just, I looked at the sanitary reports, of course, at the medical forensic discussions, they were focusing on men. And that kind of limits my own scope of analysis. But it's a criticism I'm happy to take on.
Olga and Mariana, also, thank you. I actually have one terminological question, very brief. Can you explain what is meant by hygienic modernity? I've never heard that expression. It's fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yes, this is the term, I think, introduced by Chris Otter. Hygienic modernity, it's kind of modernity that, let's start with the definition of modernity as a kind of existence or perception of the urban space. We now focus on the urban modernity. And if we talk about hygienic modernity, we think about the city as a place of order. And obviously, as we know from Marshall Urban, the city is the place of this conflict between the order, that kind of desire to create order, and the chaos, kind of the behind facades and facades, this contrast between these two spaces. So hygienic modernity then refers to these ideas or desires of urban planners, architects, city authorities to create this idealized version of the city. And ultimately, it's a failure project because in St. Petersburg specifically.
Thank you, very helpful.
I see the question from Misha Angelovsky. Just wondering if any of the historical bathhouses are still in operation. Really good question, Misha. Thank you very much. The one I showed in the pictures are not in operation anymore. It was in Soviet time, and my mom told me that she visited actually that bathhouse, which was not commercial in the Soviet time, of course. There are a couple of commercial bathhouses that are still in the same buildings that in 19th century, definitely, yeah. But not the one I showed you, not anymore. Voronin's bathhouse is the biggest one, is not bathhouse anymore, unfortunately. Christina, maybe you just switch your microphone, turn your microphone.
This is just an informational question,
yeah.
But did families go to these bathhouses? And I understand there were the ones that you talked about,
yeah.
But how did they keep the sexual activity separate from sort of family life? Because I would assume that that's not great, right? To have this going on in front of small children or even in front of adults. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, absolutely, yeah. As I said, the bathhouse commercial, but they operated like 24 hours a day, right? So, for example, evening times were probably more for sexual activities. You can come with your children in the evening slots. Also, as far as understood, sometimes, even the Mirnaya Banya was divided into sections. There were like simple one, or there were more luxurious one, but there was some division between the Mirnaya Banyas too. And some commercial bathhouses was division between them. Some were famous for offering sexual services and were famous for kind of deprived activities. And according to Znamensky, for example, families would avoid these places. They would famous for these activities, and families with children, for example, would avoid them. But there is also many, many reports in archives how, for example, a family would come and they will see a man with a lady. And he said, when he entered the bathhouse, it is his wife. and the sounds from the room was definitely not a family room activities, and they called the police to actually investigate, and it was taken to the police, and she was a prostitute, blah blah blah. So that kind of stories also happens, but like kind of unknown to us. It's kind of stories, small stories from archives, but you can get the sense that city's residents actually were very familiar with the geography of the queer encounters in the city, and they adapted their own kind of use of the commercial bathhouses, right? So they knew, for example, that Nekrasova, the bathhouse on Nekrasova, the one I showed you, was famous for queer encounters, or just broadly sexual encounters, not just queer encounters. That probably they would avoid. Do I have a lot of evidence to support these claims? I don't, but some kind of evidence suggests, yes, the city residents navigated the city. I hope I answered.
Thank you. I see another question in the chat. I think it's from Andrew Fedosov. Was there any notion of police or morality squad raiding?
Police and morality squad. Yeah. Yes. I'm just reading them. The police organized many raids, kind of policing. Yes, absolutely. For example, I mentioned in a talk very briefly that after the first round of inspections, they also raided police raids. Especially they were around at 10 o'clock in the evening. They were trying to find couples having sex in the Mirnaya Banya, and they arrested people. Yes, definitely. And they were just targeting not just homosexual men, but everyone who were at that time doing something which was supposed to be done in the Mirnaya Banya. Yeah.
Olga, that just makes me think of another question. You probably addressed this, but so is a lot of your evidence coming from police reports?
Yes, it's not only police reports, yes, also sanitary reports. The doctors would inspect commercial bathhouses, and usually it was, for example, police would identify some problems. For example, there was tip-off or something, the anonymous letter the city government received, like these bathhouses specifically unhealthy and there is immoral behavior. The police would come, do the report, and then but then doctors will come to do another report. So you have a collection of reports and observations from different institutions, not just the police. And that's how, like more broadly in my book, for example, I try to broad different sources where you wouldn't actually expect to find even the mention of the queer encounters, but they are, because it's a part of a bigger city, not just the queer city. That's what I meant.
Thank you. Sarah.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, thank you very much for that very interesting talk. Could you tell us a little bit more about the other chapters in your book and maybe some of the other kinds of spaces that are going to be of tenderness and heat?
Yeah, thank you very much. So yeah, places of heat is bathhouses, places of tenderness, commercial, for example, streets. And specifically, I talk about Tavrishevsky Garden as an example of places of tenderness where queer men would socialize, find each other. And, the supposition between tenderness as heat is very emblematic here because, in the book, I try to paint the city that offered numerous possibilities for queer men, and not just sexual possibilities, but the possibilities for friendship, for love. And my last chapter focusing on this garden as such place, all right? So where Kuzmin and his friends had encounters, they could just enjoy themselves. They would find strange interactions with the policemen too, for example, who were somehow also involved in this queer milieu. They would become friends with hooligans, and they also became lovers with hooligans who were, for example, in the previous chapters, were beaten up by them. So it's a very complex world. So yes, for example, the garden, I talk about street life as a kind of bigger concept, the street, which kind of you would expect for any history on sexuality, because of course, street was a very important place. I focus specifically on Liteyny Boro as, in my imagination, I actually didn't put it in the book, but in my imagination, this is the queer district of late Imperial St. Petersburg, because Kuzmin used to live there, not just because of that, but Kuzmin used to live there. It was kind of next to the Anichkov Bridge. I said at the beginning when I joined the room that Anichkov Bridge was the kind of geographical center of this milieu. It was very close to other nearby commercial bathhouses, other places where queer men socialize, restaurants and coffee shops, and just streets. I also talk specifically about policing, of course, more broadly in the book, and maybe Mariana, that will be useful for you, because I try to talk about level of discretion in the semi-public and public spaces, and the way in which queer men actually negotiated this place, and most importantly, how constables on the beat actually sometimes employ the level of discretion to monitor this hygienic modernity in the city. Yeah.
Thank you, Mariana. Mariana's checking
Mariana.
out. I actually had another
Sure.
question about the photograph.
Yeah.
I guess it's two photographs of the naked men in the bathhouses. Who took those pictures and why?
It's Carla Burla, a very famous photographer who lived in a German photographer who lived in St. Petersburg. It's one of the most famous, actually, he was one of the most famous photographers of late imperial St. Petersburg. And he was commissioned to take pictures of Voronezhsky bathhouses. So he took, it was amazing, actually, the album with all photos of that bathhouse, where we can see, so it's a stage photos, as I said, so it's not snapshot, but yeah, sorry.
Why? What was the why? Sorry, I'm sorry if I missed this in the talk. Who would be the audience for a big book about bathhouses?
So that was a kind of brochure to advertise the bathhouse.
Got it. Okay, sorry.
No, I didn't say it in the talk.
Okay.
Nothing to apologize. No, I didn't say it. It was just stage photos to advertise the bathhouses and to show what bathhouse attendants can do, for example, which services this bathhouse offers. For example, this progressive showers was presented in a bathhouse. Interesting that only men were photographed, actually.
Yeah.
It's itself quite fascinating thing.
Thank you for this very interesting talk. I'm so curious if you have any insight as to do you have any insight as to the queer activities that was to be known around the Imperial Guards, or there were Semyonovsky and Preobrazhensky, right?
Yeah, no, of course. Again, it's a scope of my research, and the fact that I'm a geographer. I was interested in public and semi-public spaces. And I was interested in, actually, as I said, this kind of street level activities in a way. And then the spaces of regiments. Of course, it's a homosocial environment, and it would be fantastic to investigate. It's just somehow was out of the scope of my geography, if it makes sense.
Very good.
So yeah, it's, for example, on the map I showed you at the beginning, you see the Kolonogvardievsky Boulevard was the place where most of the actually homosexual military-related people were hanging out. Not only, I have a couple of reports about just younger men just, cruising there, but it was mainly military cadets cruising along that space. But somehow, since the focus of my research was on this public and semi-public spaces, I had to limit myself to these particular spaces I mentioned. Yeah, but you're absolutely right.
That was very striking that Preobrazhensky Guards are right in the middle of your geography.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And, according to sources I studied, they participated in this queer milieu. Absolutely. They went to the Tarychesky Garden, for example, from Kuzmin, we know about that. But, my focus also, I didn't want to actually intentionally to, of course, there is a social division, social estates, the different classes of people. But what I wanted to do is actually kind of to create this diverse picture of the city where, social classes were kind of together in this queer milieu. Of course, there are social boundaries. Of course, social estates where, Mikhail Kuzmin hung out with Alexander, having sex with them, but he was a bathhouse attendant and Kuzmin was an aristocrat. So we shouldn't, and I address this question a lot in my book, we should not forget about this. But the point is actually to consider the city and the queer milieu from a bit different perspective and to think about a more kind of diverse picture in a way, and a kind of almost like a collective response to the urban environment, if it makes sense.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Fascinating. It's really amazing.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for bringing light to this whole topic. Thank you.
Thank you.
We
So-
have a question in the chat from Kevin Moss. He writes, in Gay New York, Chauncey writes about the differences in sexuality between different immigrant communities, Italians, Jews, African Americans, etc. Did you find anything similar among the various nationalities in the capital of multinational Russian Empire, or is it all Russians in the archives?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question, Kevin. It's Gay in New York is my model book. I love the book. Very good question. Thank you so much. No, different nationalities, of course, mentioned. You know, you can't avoid. It's a big topic. Clearly. Interestingly, you know, for example, Kuzmin itself has a really problematic views on Jews, for example, and he addresses this question in his diary a lot, very problematically. His friends has different views and they expressed it, but somehow what I observed that it didn't really enter the queer milieu as I understood that. You see that somehow I didn't find enough, not just information, but evidence. Maybe this is something to do in the future research, clearly, that I'm sure that the queer milieu was much more diverse than I see it right now. And I'm sure that if we look from a different perspective for different minorities in the city, you will find a different perspective, especially, I think, among Jews. But I just have to admit that I didn't find enough materials to address that issue. I touched a bit in my introduction about these differences, the urban difference, because of course, St. Petersburg was a multinational space, but it's just in my research, I was also kind of constrained by the sources in a way, and I didn't find enough sources to make claims and to make arguments. But thank you very much for this question. It's really, really interesting. No, not everyone is Russians. No, it's much more diverse than this.
This is a little bit of an aside, but as you're talking about these kind of spaces of mixing, kinds of mixing that don't necessarily happen in other places, it almost reminds me of a really intense version of the train compartment, right? Where you get these like train compartment, it's like a trope in this 19th century literature, especially where like the train compartment is the place where everybody's mixed up. And you can have conversations and cross boundaries that you wouldn't have in other places. And this almost strikes me as like an intensification of that. I could almost see like you could have a book where, you know, there's different chapters devoted to different kinds of mixing places. And this would be kind of its culmination. It's really fascinating to think of in that way in relationship to disciplining in space in the city. And in modernity.
I like your metaphor. Yes, it's very much like that actually in my mind. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think Christine, you have a question.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, actually, it's related to what we've just been talking about, but I was reminded of James Bader's book on St. Petersburg, who is also a historical geographer, and who writes about how the housing in the city itself provides a place where the classes come together, both in the street, but also in these apartment buildings. So it very much goes along with the picture that you're developing here.
I was very much inspired by his work, obviously, and you know, one of the first historical geography work was on this доходные дома, emphasizes this social stratification within these buildings, and that in fact St. Petersburg is unique in that regard because in the city center was so compact, very dense, and in one building you can see people of very different social strata, and of course and I to some extent addressed it in this book that experience of that urban environment itself is unique because, you know, you in one space, you can find people different, you know, the different perspective, and they all linger about in public and semi-public spaces. So it's, yes, absolutely. You're right. It's the city, which is kind of unique.
Well, and I think it makes an important contribution to our understanding of Russia. that there was a place and time where this was going on, and it
Yeah.
just happened to be in the capital.
Yeah, it does happen to be in the capital, but it's fantastic to think about other cities, and it's just, one of my inspirations for the future was to do something in other cities, but it might be now problematic to access these archives. So yeah.
But I
Thank you
agree
very
with
much.
you saying that this is important kind of addition. Really helps us think about Imperial Russian cities, and when I teach it, there's this big emphasis on sort of hierarchy and separation. You have the Saslovia system, you have, and this is an important reminder that there's also all of this mixing going around all the time.
That's
Yeah.
And also in this particular case, what's fascinating to me is the kind of leveling force of sexual desire. You could be a poor bathhouse attendant, but if you're really hot, you can exercise a certain power that.
Yeah. And, apart from actually thinking about sexual desire, we think about love and friendship.
Yeah.
That there's very human traits,
Yeah.
and in urban environments, sometimes love and friendship is more important than social estates. And it's a good reminder that, the city is the place where actually love and friendship can win over social estates. Probably, and it's a big assumption to make, probably stronger than in countryside or urban environment, especially back then in the 19th century. So it's absolutely. And that project let me think a lot about friendship and love, especially when you read Kuzmin's diary. It's full of loves, full of disappointment, of course, but it's tragic, but it's also beautiful, and it's beautiful there.
And it's this opening outward. I mean, we see this I can even think of Turgenev's last novel, North, is largely about mixing that can only happen in a city.
Yeah.
And cross-class, cross-Saslovia friendship that can only happen in an urban environment.
Absolutely.
Ends badly, but it's happening, and I think that's really important. And that's also why I loved that quote that you ended on. It's very, very touching and sweet. That was it. Prostatak at the end, like
yes,
just so. Kind of like, we'll see.
Yeah. So let's just do something, and we'll see. So it's this kind of quotes always made me almost cry. Like yeah, that's kind of the image of the city that, of course, idealistic. Of course, it's to some extent unrealistic, but it's nice to live with, I would put it that way. So, yeah. And since it's my hometown, it's kind of nice to live with this image, especially now.
Well, I don't see any more hands at this point. This has been incredibly fascinating discussion, really, really rich material. Very happy to kick off 2023 19V, with such an interesting discussion. So thank you all very much, and we'll see you in February.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Olga. Thank you, Mariana, as well.